adjudicates that as true or false, it's doing it in good faith, and it's doing it in a way that does reflect the true content that is being fact-checked. However, every time that you say you are wrong or you are lying, you are reducing your reputation, and there's a cost that is being paid on the group that you're fact-checking. So if consistently a fact-checker is, for example, indicating that Republicans are introducing misinformation at a very high rate, then the perceived reputation of fact-checker among Republicans is going to be lower than among Democrats, even if fact-checking is done in a purely technical and well-spirited way. So when we conducted a survey during the presidential election in Argentina in 2019, we found out that we consider to be problematic. We had, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the notions of assimilation and contrast, but we tend to perceive parties, individuals, organizations that we like as ideologically closer, and we tend to perceive organizations that we do not like as being further removed, further away. So imagine, for example, now we ask always the survey respondents from 0 to 10 or from 1 to 7, depends on the scale, where 1 is very liberal or is progressive or is on the left, and 10 is very conservative or on the right. Where would you place yourself? And individuals here in the x-axis, they say, I'm a 0, so I'm very lefty, or I'm a 10, I'm very conservative, or I'm a 5, I'm really in the middle, moderate. And then we ask them, where do you place, Bolsonaro? Where do you place Lula? Where do you place, Fox News, CBS, Beja? So every organization, we, just place it here also on the y-axis. So what we find is that if you have an organization or a party or an individual that is perceived only on positional issues, so it's perfectly measured, and individuals understand that this, for example, Lula is a 3 on the 0 to 10 scale, and everyone understands that there's a 3. So the line would be flat. It would be just a straight line from one side to the other, because everyone perceives that, for example, Lula is on the left and is a 3. But what happened is that in politics, when you don't like someone, you push that person away ideologically, and when you like it, you bring it closer. So what we found is that while the opposition at the time, now the government, the Frente de Todos, perceived Chequeado to be around 5, which is the middle of the political scale, the then government and now opposition, Cambiemos, if they were on the left, they perceived Cambiemos to be on the right. And if they were on the right, they perceive the fact-checker Chequeado to be on the left. So what we find, this line is the telltale of what is called contrast, which means that everyone is pushing Chequeado away when they are voting for Cambiemos. And that means that they have a negative perception of Chequeado that is pushing Chequeado to be perceived as ideologically distant. So every time that a fact checker indicates you're right, what we assume is that the line, tilts in the other direction. It becomes, assimilation increases. Every time that you tell someone that they're lying, contrast increasing. So we assume that there's a penalty cost on reputation when fact checkers say you are wrong, independently of whether they have good reasons to say that. So in assimilation and contrast, when we did this experiment in 2019 in Argentina, we started with a message, in this case, that was widely circulated during the presidential debate of 2019, where the opposition accused Macri of having a microphone, a earbud in the ear. So they say, they deceive us to the last time, Macri tiene un audífono en la oreja, para eso nos comimos horas de debate, so they criticize the performance of Macri, saying that he was cheating and had a earbud in the ear. And we don't consider to begin with information as being true or false and therefore to be corrected. What we assume is that information is what it is, and then you adjudicate. It can be true, it can be false, and we'll show in a second an experiment in which we're actually doing precisely that. So in this case, the individuals see this message, and voters of Fernandez, which is Frente de Todos, they retweet the message, they like the message, and they reply to a lesser extent. And on the other hand, the voters of Macri, the Cambiemos, they don't retweet the message, they don't like the message, and they are replying because they're in dialogue with them. So you present this post and you ask, would you share it? And those that are benefiting from the post, they say, yeah, we'll share it. And those that are not benefiting from the post say, we would not share it. which is the reason that we tend to think that fact checkers, when they post information, is only share that content by those that are ideologically congruent. So then we present the adjudication. We say, for example, well, that information was false. And then we ask, what happens when you present the individuals with the information that is false? And we can think about two very different processes. We can think, well, do you actually believe the fact checker? Do you believe that this information is false? So the first thing that we ask is that, do you believe that this information is false? No? And of course, voters of Macri, which were not benefited by the original tweet, and they are benefiting from the adjudication of this is false, they retweet 46%, and they say surely false, so they agree with the fact checker. 20% is false, they agree with the fact checkers, and there's only 10% that say, probably true, likely true. So only 10% are not in agreement with the fact checker, and the remainder is actually, do not know, which is also small, because you can tell that 76% of people actually believe what the fact checker is saying, and therefore we're going to show they share the content. Now, when we show the same, correction, false, to the Fernandez voters, they actually become more noisy. It's not that they say, I do not believe what the fact checker says. There's almost, 46% that believe it, way lower than the 76% from the supporter of Macri. So there's 30 points lower on how much they believe that this is actually false, as Chequeado said. But still, there's 33% that actually think that Chequeado is correct. Sorry, there's 46 that think is correct. There's only 33% that said this is probably true, surely true. So much more so than in the case of Macri. So what we have is not that these individuals believe what Chequeado is saying, these individuals do not believe what Chequeado is saying. Is that these individuals believe what Chequeado is saying, and all of these are kind of like all over the place. And when we do it with the other group, the same thing happens. So the group that is benefiting believes the fact checker, the group that is not benefiting, they're like not sure. And this is what is being represented. And of course, the group that is not sure when they vote blank vote is larger, but again, generally they are, in this case, 58% in agreement, and the number that is not agreeing is small. So you can tell that this is perfectly aligned, this is somewhat, but not as much, and this one is just pure noise, pure confusion. Okay? So assimilation and contrast means that when you have this kind of effect in which the media is saying something that you do not like, you perceive that the media organization is against you. And the notion of the hostile media effect, which is by Bayonne and Lepper and has been extended by Tetlock, is the notion that the media that you are seeing either is telling the truth and say things as they are, or they're working with the enemy. And you perceive that more generally, there's a very significant number of media that is hostile to your ideological position. And you can see, for example, among Republicans, that's the very standard norm in which the number of Republicans that perceive media as hostile, much larger than the number of Democrats that perceive the media as being hostile. And I'm pretty sure that in Brazil, although we didn't measure media hostility per se, but I'm sure that in Brazil, we have the same situation when we, for example, think about, again, as we were saying, Bolsonaro voters and PT voters, and we're going to see something I suspect in the next election, which hopefully we're going to be measured. Now, in politics, we all the time see assimilation and contrast. So we take the United States elections from 1972 to 2020. Every time that you're in agreement with the candidate, so this is the Democrats and where they see the Democratic candidates in blue. So if they are on the left, they perceive the candidate on the left. If they're on the right, they perceive the candidate to be center or relatively to the right. And Republicans that do not like the candidate, if they're on the left, they perceive the candidate as too moderate. And if they're on the right, they perceive the candidate as very extreme. No? And the same is true with the Republicans. They perceive their own candidate to be relatively moderate, while they perceive Democrats perceive the Republican candidate to be extreme. Now, notice that if I cut in the middle here, and I cut in the middle here, and I move this up or I move this down, they would be center. And that's because not only Republicans perceive that their candidate is moderate, but they perceive that their candidate is moderate and the other one is extreme. And Democrats perceive that their candidate is moderate and the other one is extreme. So the space, the middle of the political space that separates what's the middle, what's a moderate position, is different for both parties. Now, for any given individual, they are not really where the party is. They're always in the assimilation of contrast lines. That's where people live. They don't live where the party is. They live in the combination of the party and their ideology. So we added this so that you see exactly the same thing, but with Bolsonaro and with Lula in the survey that we did a couple of years ago in Brazil. And you can tell that voters of Bolsonaro, if they're on the left, perceive Bolsonaro on the left. If they're on the right, perceive Bolsonaro on the right. Voters that are not voting for Bolsonaro, if they're on the left, they perceive Bolsonaro to be very conservative. And if they're on the right, they perceive Bolsonaro to be moderate. And this is straight from the data. No processing. You just put a line where people are conditioning the party. This is what you're going to get. And you can see that this is exactly the same way that happens with Lula. But in Bolsonaro, you get the full range. It goes way wider here on those that are supporting the assimilation line, pretty big. And in Lula, the assimilation line, it doesn't get all the way to the right. If you're on the left, you perceive Lula to be leftist. If you're on the right, you perceive Lula to be a moderate. You don't perceive it to be an extreme. And in the case that those that are not voting for Lula, if you're voting against Lula, you perceive that he's a bit of a centrist. And if you're not, you perceive that he's an extreme. But notice that the range here is smaller than the range here, which means that there's way more polarization here than here. So this is the kind of distortions that you get when you compare assimilation and when you compare contrast. Now, interestingly, you can see that here there's a voter that if I switch parties, or I switch support. So here's, I'm voting for Haddad, and if I decide I'm gonna, switch and vote against Haddad, very likely I think that that's because Haddad is too moderate. So I jump this line. So I'm voting for Haddad. I think that he's where I decide, you know what, I'm not voting for Haddad. So Haddad suddenly, why not? Why are you not voting for Haddad? Well, he's too moderate. And if I'm on this side and I'm voting for Haddad, I think that he's kind of a moderate. And I say, I'm not going to vote for Haddad. And you ask, why are you not voting for Haddad? Well, he's too extreme. Okay, so motivated reasoning means that you're not just aware of this line. You actually jump from one line to the other when you switch support. And that's what we constantly see. Imagine that you're voting for any party and you decide you're not going to vote for any party and ask you why, then you push ideologically that party away from where you are. So what we're trying to measure is exactly that. How do you push people away? But in this case, what we're interested in is how do you push the fact checker away when you tell you're wrong, when the dislike that you have for the fact checker increases, which is what contrast measures. I see that the interval, I see a question here. So I'm not sure, Tiago, if you wanted to add something or if this is. Oh, I
was actually just curious just to understand why the confidence intervals are pretty much the same, because I imagine that there are very few voters on the extremes if you vote for the other candidate.
Which is true.
Curious about that. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Which is true in the case of the US. And which is also true in some cases in which we find ideology to be better grounded on the left and the right. One of the interesting things that we have with Bolsonaro is this very odd situation in which a lot of the people vote for Bolsonaro, they find themselves to be in the center left to the center of the political spectrum. Although you have more on the right, you do not have the same level of discrimination that you have in the US. So when you measure here in the US, the confidence intervals here are high and here are low. And when you measure this one, the confidence interval here are high and here are low, because you have a lot of Republicans here and you have a lot of Democrats here, but you don't have a lot of Democrats here and you don't have a lot of Republicans here. Here. So, sorry, I couldn't hear what? Oh, okay. So the other thing that is interesting, if you notice here, is that precisely because of what Tiago was mentioning, if most of the anti-Bolsonaro is here and most of the pro-Bolsonaro are here, means that the mean of the party is located here, although it should be here. which means that parties tend to be observed as more extreme than they are, because people observe them at the mean, but the mean includes those that are opposing the candidate, those that are in favor of the candidate. So the mean is always more extreme than what you would expect, which means that the political space always looks more polarized than it is, because it's always heavier on the assimilation and contrast side of the political effect. So once we see the dynamic, you see, well, let's shock that dynamic and see what happens when you therefore tell people you are wrong, and therefore you reduce assimilation and increase contrast, which means that you push the line in which you see them favorably away, and you push the line in which you see them disfavorable. So that way you are changing the angle of the information and not the mean. So we had during the COVID a lucky situation, which again, lucky in COVID, but anyway, which is we have some information that was circulating that is strange. So for example, this post by Infobae, it says, Argentina es el país con más muertes por COVID por millón de habitantes en el día en el mundo. So this kind of information, every country that we analyze, we have it. I'm sure that in Brazil, there is some day in which the news, some news organizations say Brazil is #1 in the world. And in the case of Brazil, they actually were several days in which that would have been true. And it's very likely that there's also some days in which some organizations say Brazil, the country in the world with the most cases of COVID in the world, and it was not true. So in the case of Argentina, we had this day in October 2nd, 2020, where Infobae said Argentina is a country with most deaths of COVID by a million of inhabitants, and it was not true. And the fact checker, Chequeado, actually posted, it is not true, is number 19 and not #1 as it's reported. Yeah. So in this case, we can adjudicate as false. And therefore, we can see that those that benefited from this would be hurt when it said that it's not true. But interestingly enough, the same exact post, but with a different picture, here we only swapped the picture so that it would be identical, was published in May 20, 2021. So it was posted 6 months later. And it says, Argentina, the country in the world with the most cases of COVID per inhabitants. But this time, it was actually true. That day, it was true that Argentina was the country in the world with the most cases of COVID. So Chequeado did not fact check that one, but we did, so that we could actually split the sample and give, half of the people received this, half of the people received this. Actually, it's 1/3 and 1/3. We have a control group. And therefore, we have information that is true and information that is false. So people see the same content, but then we adjudicate this as being true or false randomly. So that it matches the original post, but is randomly assigned to the groups. And therefore, we can see to what extent telling someone you're right or telling someone you're wrong is affecting the extent to which they perceive the fact checker as being of high reputation or as being of low reputation. So the way in which we do this, therefore, is we divide the sample randomly and we assign a check and a true and a false condition. And we ask them to what extent they would share it, and we ask them how it makes them feel. And therefore, we have a reaction, a behavioral response to the treatment that we are producing. So I'm not sure if that's a question. Okay. So,
o microfone está aberto só.
Yeah, it was just in case. So now, different from this general treatment, we also introduce a different flow. So we have one group in the control group that is going to see the original tweet, then is going to respond questions about how much reputation they see for different news organizations, including the fact checker. And we also ask where do they see different organizations ideologically, including the fact checkers. We don't only ask the fact checkers, we ask La Nación, Clarín, Página 12. So we have several news media organizations that are asked what's the reputation and what's the ideology. And then we include that we include Chequeado among those. And a different group receives the true or false adjudication. And after that, they indicate to what extent they perceive the reputation and the ideology of different news organizations, including the fact checker. So that way we have a group that sees this tweet, but has not seen the adjudication that tells us how much reputation and what the ideological position of media organizations, including Chequeado. And then we have some group that saws that is going to be treated with the original tweet, with the adjudication, and then they respond the ideology and the reputation questions. And the ideology is from 1 to 7, where 1 is liberal or progressive or left, and the 7 is conservative. Where would you place yourself? Then where would you place, Nación, Clarín, Página 12, and Chequeado? And then they see this one, and we also ask from 1 to 5 stars, when 1 is low quality and 5 stars is high quality, how many stars would you give to Nación, Clarín, Página 12, etc.? And therefore we have a measure of quality, of reputation. So let me show you a couple of the assimilation and contrast that we have for the general media organizations. So same issue, you can think of this rather than La Nación. We could have, here Bella, as I was saying, or Antagonista. And you would have kind of the same thing. So we have Frente de Todos, supporter of Fernández, Cambiemos, supporters of Macri, or maybe Larreta next time, or Vidal. And we have, therefore, that these are voters in yellow that are generally more conservative and that are supporting Cambiemos. And in blue, you have generally voters that are more progressive and that are voting for the Frente de Todos, Fernández. What we have is that when we consider a conservative media like La Nación, voters that are on the right perceive, if they are not voting for Cambiemos, if they're voting for Frente de Todos, the voters that are on the right, they perceive La Nación is, kind of moderate. But the voters on the left perceive La Nación to be extreme right. And when we consider voters of Cambiemos, we see that the voters on the right perceive La Nación as being relatively moderate, and they perceive La Nación to be more, slightly, from center right to center. So voters that are voting for Cambiemos, they're in the assimilation, and voters that are from the Frente de Todos are in the contrast line. Very well split. When we consider Página 12, we have a different situation, and we see that voters of Frente de Todos are in the assimilation line, so the media moves with them. If they move to the right, the media moves to the right, and the voters of Cambiemos are on the contrast line. If they move to the right, the media moves to the left. So you can see assimilation is always going up and contrast is always going down. But of course, it's different groups that are doing it. And when you consider where they switch, this is a location at which, if I decide to switch from Cambiemos to Frente de Todos, I still see the media organization in the same place. And we consider this the unbiased location. And you can see that in the unbiased location, La Nación is slightly center-right and Página 12 is slightly center-left. But the truth is that almost nobody's there. Most of the people are either here and here, or most of the people are here and here, just as with the parties. When we do the same for Infobae and for Chequeado, we find Infobae that is behaving just like La Nación, just slightly closer to the middle here, but again, high contrast and moderate assimilation. But, interestingly enough, we don't find that overall there's an assimilation and contrast effect in Chequeado for the control group before they've been free. So there's different from what we saw in 2019. This is the intermediate election. There's less of an emphasis. There's less information about the election. There's slightly less polarization than what we had in 2019. And we have that Chequeado is not perceived as with much contrast as before, although you can tell that the group by Cambiemos is still the one that is moving from one side to the other. And the difference between this group and this group in Cambiemos is statistically significant. It's just very modest, but it is statistically significant. So once we have that, we then check when we gave them this tweet, who is sharing this. And as expected, voters of Cambiemos share that Argentina is a country with the most COVID. The same would be expected with voters in this case of anti-Bolsonaro voters in Brazil. You would expect that they would share it. They would be pro-attitudinal. And we have that voters of Fernández, they're flipped compared to the other graph, but voters of the Frente de Todos, which is Fernández, they're not sharing the original content because they don't perceive that is cognitively congruent. They don't like that Argentina is record number of cases. When we gave them the true or the false adjudication, the voters of Cambiemos, when it's true that Argentina is record of COVID, so the fact checking is saying you're right, goes to 29%, 17% of like, and there's a few replies. And when we do the same for the Frente de Todos, we have that they are sharing, retweeting and liking when it's false. So this group, pro-attitudinal sharing of it was false, Argentina was not record, and this group is, pro-attitudinal sharing of Argentina is record, which is exactly what we expect and serves as a validation of the treatments. So once we do that, then we measure to what extent the reputation, which is this one, number of stars, and ideology, reputation and ideology, which is this one, to what extent they are decreasing when you give them the counter-attitudinal, and to what extent they are pushed away when you are giving information that is not congruent. So one of the interesting things that happens here in the reputation is that, as expected, you can see that the pro-attitudinal response, so in the case of Cambiemos, it was true, increases the reputation of the fact checker. So when we ask individuals how reputable is the fact checker in Argentina, we get almost half a star more. And compared to the it is false that Argentina's record, there's a drop of 0.3 in the stars. So if you have 3 stars, you have 3.5 in this case. And if you have 3 stars, you have 3.1 when you see the false. One of the interesting things that we've been discussing with Thiago, with Natalia, and the other day in a presentation was, why is this line not in the middle? We expected this line in the control group to be in the middle, which means that the individuals that are not receiving any information, they're not moving, they're in the middle of being punished and in the middle of being rewarded. But the group that is a control group is not here in the middle, is actually on this side, which means that the anchor that they have or the frame that they have when there's no information is different than being both adjudicated as true or adjudicated as false. That said, we can see that, in fact, when you give them the true or the false adjudication, the pro-attitudinal one increases the number of stars more than the counter-attitudinal one. It is a good question why we have this change in the magnitude from the control group. The other interesting thing that we have here is that ideological distance declines, as is expected in the pro-attitudinal. But we don't get it in the counter-attitudinal. We don't have a significant effect. So it means assimilation is increasing slightly, but not contrast. You can see that most of that is a Simpson paradox effect, has to do with the aggregates. So when we split the groups, you can actually see that the treatment and control works very well for the Frente de Todos. So this is left to right, this is left to right, this is where I see chequeado, this is where I see myself, and the treatment group, if it's true, and therefore is counter-attitudinal, the Frente de Todos perceives that chequeado is more conservative than when you see the false, in which you perceive that chequeado is closer to you. So just as expected, when you treat them with it is true, which means you're punishing me, I perceive that you are further away ideologically. And when you say it is false, so you're rewarding me, I perceive that you're closer to me ideologically. But we don't find the same effect on Cambiemos. In Cambiemos, you can see that changing from false to true improves a bit the standing. So it moves in the right direction, but it's not statistically significant. So that means that ideologically, I'm increasing assimilation when I tell Cambiemos what they want, but I cannot flip it the other way around. We were expected that you would flip it. We can't. The question of whether the thing is that there's a dosage issue or it's more ingrained on the conservative voters that they are far away, that we do not know. When we see assimilation and contrast and we zoom in, you can see here the difference for the Frente de Todos. And you can see here when it moves from false to true, which is the same as before. But here what we do is we also see the number of stars. So this is from 1 to 5, the number of stars. So higher is more reputation. lower is less reputation. And you can see that for Cambiemos, there's a relationship between reputation and ideology. So voters on the right see a larger drop in reputation with the adjudication of false. So when they say counterattitudinal, they perceive that the drop in reputation for Ciclo is pretty large. But for the voters that are on this side, there's really not much of a change. So most of the change is on this side, and it's ideological. On the reputation, on the other hand, you can see the Frente de Todos, for everyone, the drop is about the same. So I give it about 3 stars, slightly less than 3 stars when it's pro-attitudinal, it's false, so it's working with me, so I give it more stars. But when it's true, I give it fewer stars, but there's no relationship with ideology. So we only find the same problem here. So here it doesn't flip completely, and here, therefore, the ideology is also parsed into the stars. And in this case, it flips completely, and we can see that there's no difference in the stars, that all the information is being transferred here, which explains what we have here as a much more noisy outcome on the side of Cambiemos. So what we have is to some extent what we expected, but milder. We expected that the shift in assimilation and contrast was going to be stronger. We expected that the voters of Cambiemos would see the shift from assimilation to contrast for the treatment completely, and we only see a partial shift. And we also see milder differences in assimilation and contrast than we expected. In 2019, the range of the contrast line was larger than in 2021. Again, that could reflect a difference on the information that you expect in a presidential election as in 2018 compared to what you expect on a midterm election as in 2021. But the fact is that the treatments were successful. People share as expected, people responded as expected, people share the correction of true and false as expected, but the assimilation and contrast effects were only visible on one of the parties and were slightly milder than what we expected. So the next step on the research, because as I was saying, we just finished this, is to assess other heterogeneous effects by controlling, for the other social demographic factors, and for the level of interest in politics, and for the level of perceived risk from misinformation, and I have already said interest in politics. So that's basically, in a nutshell, where we are with this project. The next stage is likely trying to solve why the anchor of the control group is not in the middle, because that means that there's some frame shift that we are not measuring. That raises a whole discussion that we have with Thiago in particular, to what extent the anchor really reflects something that is in the middle, or once you fact check, you are moving the entire framing to a different plane, and therefore there's no prior in which people just have a standing belief about Ciclo, and then you're shooking that. But when you're introducing the new information, you're actually changing the scale, the anchor for everyone. I'm not sure, Thiago, if you want to add anything.
No, I'm good. I think that was pretty much what we have been doing and discussing the last few months.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. Thank you very much, Thiago. Ernesto was a wonderful presentation, very different research design. Before giving the audience for questions and comments, I will make 2 little questions. And I will speak in Portuguese, okay? Slowly, you'll surely understand. Uma pergunta sobre o resultado mais acentuado na direita política, entre os conservadores. A minha impressão, até onde conheço, é que no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos temos o mesmo fenômeno. uma direita política mais extremada, e esse fato se reflete no modo pelo qual as redes sociais são utilizadas na política. A pergunta é de ignorante, né? Que não acompanha tanto a literatura. Isso é replicado em outros lugares do mundo, por exemplo, se observarmos Europa, vamos constatar o mesmo fenômeno. Né? Essa é uma questão, uma pergunta, tá, Ernesto? Uma segunda pergunta, mais teórica. A pesquisa de vocês vem confirmando a teoria do reasoning, motivated reasoning, não é? Repetidamente. No entanto, a visão corrente sobre as redes sociais e seu papel na política é a de distorcer a informação disponível, não é, nas competições eleitorais. E isso teria que ver com a técnica, com o meio, com a rede social. A rede social teria em si algo diferente de outros meios que a tornam muito mais distorcivas, muito mais fortes, né, nesse aspecto, né, de distorcer o debate político. Mas os resultados que vocês mostram é que as redes sociais estão apenas reiterando, não é, um comportamento que ocorreria mesmo sem a rede social. Portanto, ela não tem um papel decisivo na explicação sobre polarização, por exemplo, um dos efeitos contemporâneos importantes, né? Portanto, a polarização não é um efeito forjado do uso das redes sociais, da sua disseminação na competição eleitoral. Então, são essas duas perguntas sobre a generalização do comportamento à direita, mais extremado na utilização da rede social, e qual é o papel da rede social na polarização. São essas duas perguntas.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. So let me start with the first one. The question of why we find stronger effects on the left and the right. So you're absolutely right. I mean, generally, we tend to think of polarization and assimilation and contrast, not as just the distance between the left and the right, but the perceived distance. What I was showing is that if the mean of the perceived location is to the right or to the left, or their actually location, because you're pushing them to the extremes, the perception of polarization is larger. You can think of that as, you have one glass that makes things farther away and another one that makes it closer, and you think like someone that has big glasses. And what we have is that the glasses are thicker on the right than on the left. So the level of distortion that you get on the right, the perceived distance, how much you push the other party, how extreme Lula is perceived, for example, tends to be larger than what you have on the other one. Of course, Lula and Bolsonaro are very different types of politicians, and therefore Lula is not a good example of what the right perceives as the center of the political space. When you consider the shift on the center of the political space, I think that the shift on the right in Brazil, in the United States, in Argentina, in England, in all of the places that we're measuring, the glass is thicker on that side. The perception of threat, the perception of media hostility, we tend to see that as stronger on the right. Now, that produces a paradoxical result. Imagine that you're receiving heavy dosages of some medicine. That also means that your level of tolerance is such that as you increase or decrease the dosage, the change is smaller. So imagine also that you have more political information. So the more political information you have, on the one hand, more motivated reasoning means that you're changing. But on the other hand, how much you can shook from the position is more difficult to estimate. So the question that we have in this survey that we're going to have to sort out is to what extent what we have is a question of dosage, and therefore we don't see the change because already contrast is high. So one piece of information shifted, but not as much. And on the other group, motivated reasoning is weaker, and the effect is weaker, so it was in the middle. So when we shook one way or we shook the other one, it moves more. So that's not a signal that they're more polarized on the left, but a signal that the dosage that requires to move it is smaller. So those two things need to be separated. We think that the polarizations are on the right, which doesn't mean that they're more sensitive to the treatments. So that goes on the second question, which I think is crucial, which is what the internet adds to this equation. So we had in the previous research that we were doing with Tiago and Natalia, that when we were measuring trust, we did this experiment. And when people actually retweeted, they were way more sensitive to the treatment. So we haven't tested this in the news data because I was saying it just came out. So this is basically the results, first results. But the next stage of this is we have to see to what extent the treatment is stronger on the people that said retweet compared to the individuals that did not. What we consistently find is that doing Twitter is different than reading Twitter. That when we have people that do Twitter, the treatments that we produce a sharper effect. So we expect in this, although we haven't run the data, we expect on this that for the group that's retweeted, the change in the assimilation and contrast line and the reputation has to be larger than the people that just read it, that those that read it and ignore it. So when you're on the internet and you decide that you retweet, you produce a commitment effect. Not only do you see the information, but you now are invested in that information being correct because you actually share it. So the act of sharing it is different from the old way in which we would think about the media, because it's not that the content is different. The content is the same. It's not even that the content is more massive. It's not even that more people share the content. It's the fact that this is content that you are allowed to share. And that when you do, Tetlock uses the term the intuitive politician for the fact that when you do that, now you are on the hook. You are responsible for sharing content and you're committed to the content. So internet is very different. Social media is very different from the old media because it produces the intuitive politician effect. It produces a commitment effect, which means that people suddenly they need to be accountable for sharing content. And there are a few cases in which this is so clearly as in misinformation. When someone can say, hey, you're sharing crap. That is not true. Why are you sharing that content? So you're actually being subject to the cost of being you, the one that is sharing that information. So we haven't checked this, but the second line of reasoning that we argue in what we've been doing and is going to the book is commitment and exposure are not the same thing. And that's why in our findings, what is called incidental exposure, which means you're looking your stuff and suddenly misinformation appears. And we were like all concerns about incidental exposure. You're incidentally exposed to a lot of political information. Is that relevant? Well, it doesn't seem to be relevant in our experiments. People that are not engaging with the content we give, they are not having an effect. We haven't measured on this one, but in the other experiments, incidental exposure is not having much of an effect. So it's an interesting question to what extent this is going to still happen in this new experiment, but we do expect that that's going to be the case.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. João.
Hi, Ernesto. I think I'm going to ask my question in English. Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the wonderful presentation. I thought it was very interesting. As a matter of fact, I work with, I lead a research group that does kind of a mainstream media watchdog that has a website, and we do quantitative sentiment analysis of major media coverage in Brazil, coverage of politics and economics. And, my comment is actually related to what I would say the communicative health of Brazilian democracy, right? From this perspective, in the sense that what good does fact-checking do at the end of the day? That's, the question I wanted to ask you. Because here in Brazil, and I've been to many different events in which I participated and discussed with people who, are in the fact-checking agencies of Brazil. And the operations we have here, they're all sort of tied with major media outlets. So the people who run them are people who actually have big posts in the big media in Brazil. And journalists, some of them are famous. And but the ties are pretty clear. Some of them are explicitly connected to these media operations, right? And I think that, since Brazilian mainstream media has this long history of political manipulation and of political bias, and it's there in the academic production on communication studies and communication politics in Brazil too. It's not only I who's saying that. So it seems to me that, the major problem here is that if you see the bylaws of the fact-checking agencies, they do not examine or fact-check news put out by mainstream media. You know what I'm saying? And mainstream media in Brazil is known for producing also fake news, or for distorting the news to a point in which people come to conclusions that are ultimately fake or distorted, if you want to use this different word, right? So, I'm not sure if that only relying on some sort of social identity theory like you seem to have done in your presentation solve this problem. Because, I know that evaluations may vary according to in-group or all-group perceptions, but I think in terms of the importance of communication, of political communication to democracy, that doesn't do the trick. I mean, that doesn't, give us, I think, tools to understand, what to do in terms of, for example, of regulation, and how to think of the importance and role of the media in Brazilian democracy and democracy elsewhere too. Because at the end of the day, if the approach, it seems to me that the SIT approach ends up by being a little relativistic, right? But in the end, it seems to play on the side of big media, right? Because the problem is in the eye of the beholder, not in their coverage. But I think that in Brazil, and I think in Argentina too, I suspect, I don't know, I'm not a specialist, but I suspect there's a problem there too. So, how do we deal with this problem at the end of the day? And it's a major problem. It's been a major problem. So just to give you an example, the last thing you said related to when you responded to Fabiano's contention, you were talking about like if someone is accidentally exposed to some sort of information. But the Brazilian population was exposed to a media campaign, right, that lasted years, more than a decade, that tried to prove that Lula was a major gangster and PT was the center of Brazilian corruption, although we know this is not entirely true, right? We are like a people of, political scientists, we're fairly sophisticated in terms of, I would like to believe that, in terms of political information. And we know it's not entirely true. And that had a major effect in Brazilian politics, major effect. So how can we account for that? Using your approach.
Thank you. So, let me answer in very different ways because there are very different things that are touched on. So, let me put it this way: if fact-checking didn't exist, it wouldn't change anything of what you were mentioning, because a lot of what you were mentioning had to do with traditional media. But notice that the example that I was given, the fact-check that we were using was of traditional media. So the post that I showed was fact-checking that was conducted on a traditional media that was reporting on a partisan content that was false, that benefited one of the parties. So it is true that in some cases, fact-checking is not fact-checking the powerful, doesn't speak true to power, to put it this way, but there's actually a lot of variation on that. Even in Brazil, fact-checkers generally might not fact-check large organizations with respect to some of the, Bolsonaro, not Bolsonaro, Lula issues, but they do, for example, on the effectiveness of the vaccine. So there are domains in which fact-checking is still operation, and it's not speaking on the issue of Bolsonaro and Lula in the same way that it speaks to, for example, whether the vaccine works against Omicron. But notice that if you actually say that the vaccine works against Omicron, you are actually also increasing the salience of an issue that didn't benefit Bolsonaro. So just to say that in fact-checking, there's a very broad range of issues. And even in the cases in which power in the media is distorting politics to the extent that it does it in Brazil, you still have some domains in which that fact-checking is still being used that is somewhat different. Now, that goes to the other things that we can learn with fact-checking, which is not with fact-checking, with what we're doing. So to what extent do people actually believe the campaigns that indicate that, for example, Lula is a mobster or a criminal, or, to what extent do they believe the information that is produced? We don't have information, that is coming from the surveys, and that people believe it to the extent than we think. And that's why Lula today is front runner in the election. There might be huge polarization and a significant number of people that are very anti-Lula, but it's not true that the people that are anti-Lula is because they bought into this narrative. It's way more likely that they're anti-Lula, and that's why they repeat the narrative, and not that they're anti-Lula because they repeat the narrative. If not, we would have to explain why is it that Lula is front runner in the surveys now, where people is exposed to the same exact content. So information, if we believe research and communication of the last 60 years, we accept that there's no hypodermic solution by which you just spew things through social media and through traditional media and people believe it. If we truly think that it is not true that you can inoculate people with content and they believe it, then we have to take a more nuanced approach of what is media doing exactly when it accuses Bolsonaro of being a mobster, and to what extent, Lula, and to what extent that's actually believed. Now, that issue is not the same as the question of fact-checking. So part of the research we do has to do with fact-checking, and what we were trying to see was not so much just whether people believe it, but to what extent they stop sharing information. So let me imagine this situation. We have some traditional media that says that Lula is a corrupt mobster, okay? And that information is not shared by a large number of people. And we have other, a number of informations that are being posted that say that Lula is not really a good president, high quality president. And that information is widely shared. So we have a saturated social media that, for example, is amplifying one frame, but not the other, okay? It is critical to understand why some people are sharing one of the frames and not the other. Because in that case, the question is not why, for example, Beja produces one that says he's inept and another one that is corrupt. The question is, why is the one that says that he's inept or corrupt is the one that is becoming viral? And why is that being amplified to a different extent? And why is that amplified in one part of the network, like, for example, supporters of Bolsonaro, or in another part of the network, like, for example, supporters of Lula? So what we are generally thinking in processing this is that networks are complex phenomena where you put information in, but only some part of the information is activated. That's not just true of fact-checking, that's also true of traditional media. The big question is why some of those are activated and what kind of frame they produce. Make sense?
It does, but do you account for intensity, for example?
Yeah, of course. So imagine—
I mean that, how many outlets are divulging such and such information? Because here in Brazil, it varies a lot.
So we mapped the entire Brazil political election of Bolsonaro, and we were observing all the different outlets that were producing misinformation, and including all those outlets that were suddenly taken out of Twitter and YouTube because those accounts were canceled. So we can actually see a change in the frequency with which each one of the frames is being activated. Our interest is, okay, so imagine that you have Movimento Brasil Libre and they put, 30 videos and they're, circulating the web, in internet. Where are they circulated? It is not true that they circulate everywhere. You can actually see that they're very heavily concentrated in a few regions of the network where they are circulated. And the areas in which they're circulating are areas that already believe the videos that are being presented, and they are amplifying that content. And that's why we say often that what they do is not to convince people, but to activate that content, to make that people, to make the issue more salient. But again, we have to evaluate where it's coming, how much it activates, how it changes behavior. Does it change its behavior in sharing, or is anyone actually changing their mind? What we have is that overwhelmingly people change what they think is important when you're increasing the frequencies, but not so much where they stand in politics. And what we have is that when you increase this type of information that is toxic, they change assimilation and contrast, but not the mean, not where you see in the content. So what you're seeing is you're increasing perceived polarization. So I'm not trying to give you a unified response. I'm saying precisely that when we think, for example, on the brain and we show an image and the brain activates a region, we tend to think why that region and not the other. And in social media, I think we have to do the same thing, which is not to think just overall how things are being placed there, but why is it that sometimes some regions activate and why other regions don't? And what do they mean by framing when there are traditional media that offer certain contents, but only some of that content is being activated by others? So I connect with the other. In misinformation, if we have, for example, misinformation on vaccine that goes viral, oftentimes what we want with fact-checking is not that the truth is amplified, but that misinformation goes down. You want to put the false information back in the forest. You don't want to increase the salience of vaccines do not cure, because if you do that, you're actually increasing the amount of doubt that people have with respect to vaccines. What you want is the misinformation to decline, not to the information by the fact checker to become viral. So sometimes you want to amplify content, both by the fact checker, and sometimes you want to depress content, which means the fact checker should not get a message that is widely shared, but a message that cuts the circulation of misinformation. A lot of what we're doing in framing is to see to what extent when you intervene, you're not changing minds, but you're changing the rate at which misinformation circulates. You're changing the regions in which it circulates. And in that regard, fact-checking actually works. Consistently, we find that interventions by fact checkers depress the amount of misinformation that is being circulated on topic, and that the penalty cost of the individuals that are sharing misinformation increases, and therefore even those that are actors that are doing for political gain this and do not believe the information, but they're doing it for politics, even those actors decline how much information they're putting out that is misinformation. So again, whether they work or not depends on whether you want to see sharing, whether you want to see change in salience, whether you want to see change in attitudes. And all those things have to be measured with different treatments, with different experiments, so that we can see globally how each mechanism is working. So you might be right. Maybe traditional media where it's very toxic, like in Serpico, everyone is corrupt. You have a clean cop, it's shot. Completely different situation where everyone is clean, one corrupt cop goes to jail. So I understand that if the media is really toxic, traditional media is very toxic, interventions by fact checkers are going to be evaluated very different than in places where the media is not toxic. But we have to understand both. What happens when you intervene in an environment in which traditional media is toxic, and what happens when they're not? Not sure, Tiago, if you want to add. I'm, given that Tiago is here, I take advantage of that to see whether he wants to.
I just think that there are no easy solutions for this kind of problems, and I think that the issue that João raised is more on media regulation than on what we're trying to do with fact checkers. Yeah, and I think that and just to add, on Ernesto just said, I think that we need more research on the issue of regulation and on policy, both on media but also on new technologies. I think that as political scientists, we have overall produced very little on how to regulate both media and new technologies. For example, what we are seeing now with Twitter is Twitter is very close to be bought by a billionaire, and we don't know how this can affect the whole structure of the social media environment. And as political scientists, in some sense, we don't have a lot of accumulated knowledge on the effects of different types of regulations on the social media environment. And I think that I agree in some sense with João that we need more research on this, and I think that that's a little bit of where João is trying to go. But I do think that we have enough accumulated evidence that fact checkers, they have effects on sharing, on beliefs, on issue salience, and they have a role to play, particularly when we are dealing with, for example, issues of health misinformation, climate misinformation, that are important to be checked, because there are more the decisions on what, sorry?
Policy oriented.
Yeah, and then the decisions that on what exactly constitutes a issue to be checked or a false information are more clear. So it is, and the consequences are also larger. So I think that in this sense, fact checkers are super important.
Yeah, I was a couple of days ago in a conference in NYU, and one of the papers that I liked the most was about platform switching. To what extent, when Musk, for example, buys Twitter, if he ends up doing it, how it changes the composition of Twitter, to what extent there's going to be migration or not. Like when Trump was banned from Twitter, to what extent he produced migration or not to Parler. So regulation of both social media and traditional media, I think they do have to be explored together, not just separately. So, but now that Musk come, Thiago leaves Twitter, of course. It was to be expected.
Okay, Ernesto, we have one more question here. Isabelle Camacho Soares. In sum, did you expect the results or did you have a surprise? You want to...
I think that results always surprise you. Assimilation and contrast, luckily for us, we know that they're extremely reliable. It's every data set that you're going to find in Brazil is going to find assimilation and contrast. It's just less explored on media issues. I think that the two things that surprised us and that are the ones that we're going to be both evaluating in this research and with the next research are the question of what does it mean to have an anchor for a control group. That was a big problem here, and we did not expect that the no information group was going to be would give lower reputation than both of the treated groups, and I think the other surprise was that we anticipated that could happen, but still was noticeable. The question of the dosage, how much misinformation is necessary, or how much correction, adjudication is necessary for producing a change in one group or the other group. Those were the two most important ones. But funny enough, this entire experiment came from a surprise. The surprise was we have contrast in one group and not in the other. So we conducted the new one to see to what extent we could explain that mechanism. And when we did, we found that we could explain it on the group that was not assimilated or contrasted in the first one, and we couldn't make the group that was already contrasted change as much. So this experiment was a response to something we could not understand in the previous one, and we learned more. But I'm not sure that we actually answer the question that triggered this experiment, which was why was the conservative group more contrasted to begin with? So we got a surprise, the anchoring, but also we have something left unexplained that we still need to dive in, hopefully with the next experiment.
Can I just add one thing here?
Yeah, sure.
So just because this is kind of important, I think that it's important to share. When nowadays, like when you do an experimental design like this, the best practice is for you to pre-register your expectations. So what basically happens is that before we get the data for our analysis, we have to write what we expect to find. So we have to go to a public portal, which is usually the Open Society framework. And we have to write basically like a draft of the paper saying like, that's our theory. We have these expectations. Those are our hypotheses. Those are our instruments. That's how we are gonna estimate our models, and we expect to find that. So before we get the data back, we wrote our pre-registration that was saying like, we expect pro-attitudinal to generate simulation and contrast. We expect contra-attitudinal to go in this direction. We expect pro-attitudinal to increase reputation, contra-attitudinal to decrease reputation. So we had all of this in a public portal that anybody can access and see what we expected to find before we got the data in our hands. So at this point, if we find a surprise, it's actually, we are fine with the surprise because the readers know what we were expecting, and we can actually explain our surprise based on our initial expectations and be very transparent with the whole research process. And even if we find a no result, we can say that's a no result, and you can see that we were not expecting the no result, but it is a very transparent no result. So this is to protect science to be forged in some sense, and people running like multiple regressions and multiple comparisons to finding results that are just like by chance and not robust results. So in this sense, it's good that we have the pre-registration. Now we can deal with the surprise that we found.
In fact, we had 8 experiments that we pre-registered on this surveys. It was a panel with both ways before and after the election. So we have 8 different experiments that were run in the survey that we pre-register.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Very good to know. We will verify. More questions? Mais questões? No questions on YouTube. I think that there are no questions here also in the room. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Ernesto. Thank you very much, Thiago. It was wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Wonderful discussion.
Great.
And we are anxious looking forward to seeing the more results. Okay.
Thank you. Hi,